We've got Brian Allison, and he's just been downloading so much intense information about writing, just standard writing, using quills and pens. And it's always fascinating to have conversations with Brian because he knows so much wonderful stuff. So recently, we had the series Turn, and it had spy stuff in it. Yes. 18th century, Revolutionary War period, spy stuff. They did do spy stuff, right?
Oh, very much so.
And they did have spy inks and paper and special ways to write and spycraft in the 18th century. And you've studied some of that.
Very much so.
Tell me about some of the neat spy stuff for Revolutionary War period.
Well, it's the art of hiding things is an old one. It goes back to Caesar. In fact, the first cipher, and by the way, there's a difference between codes and ciphers.
Okay.
Codes tend to be when you take a subject and give it a numerical or letter code. So and that's usually used with code books. And in the Revolution, you saw that with in Turn. You'd see that where they'd say like 137 is the king, or 567 means Spain. That's a code book and a code, and that's the way they did it. Ciphers are where you use a table that replaces each letter with another symbol.
Okay.
So the first cipher in history was the Caesarian cipher, where Julius Caesar used it, and it's called a shift cipher. In other words, you take the alphabet, A, B, C, D, D, all the way to Z, then you shift it over several letters, and you put right over the A, H, I, J, K, L, and then go all the way up to the G. And then when you're writing the letter, if you want to substitute, you instead of an A, you write H. B is I. And so you'd say, H, I, Z, all these strange letters, and that would hide the message. That was enough for Roman times. That was the very first cipher. And all of them
it would confuse me.
Exactly. And with most people, with me, I'd look at it and say, if I didn't know what it was. Now, a mathematician can crack that in 5 seconds today. I mean, a computer can do it in no time. So this was this constant struggle between, and this was the age of reason. This was the age of learning. Mathematicians absolutely loved the challenge of cracking a code. So it's actually a high point in espionage history that's kind of unsung, where there was a race between the mathematicians breaking the codes and people coming up with new ciphers. And all through this era you see it, and not just in military circles. Turn shows the Culper spy ring, which is Samuel Culper Jr., or Sr. actually, who turns out to be a very boring farmer named Abraham Woodhull in New York. It took him years to figure out who he was. And this kind of haphazard spy ring that miraculously didn't get anybody hanged, and they were able to give George Washington wonderful information. And it's a compelling story, but that's not just the only part of it. I mean, diplomats used it. Some of the most entertaining stories you'll see is in John Adams' correspondence, where he's always just completely frustrated with James Lovell, who's one of the congressional figures at the time, and who comes up with all their diplomatic ciphers. And he applies to Adams the code name CR, and gives him this CR code to work.
Right.
It's confusing. You get one letter off, the whole message goes off. I mean, even today, I've tried to use the CR cipher, and I'm going, wait a minute, where did I lose this? Because if you do that right in the middle of a word, you can lose an entire letter on one mistake. And he is constantly complaining in his letters. He's getting these instructions from Lovell about these high-ranking things. And he's saying basically something from Lovell about mine of the 24th, who knows what nonsense, I can't read it. He's just like constantly complaining in his letter. So that is just so human, but this is part of everyday life in those days. A lot of great men like George Washington used ciphers to hide business deals or secrets like that. And in private life, love affairs were often using ciphers to hide things and codes. So it's a fascinating subject, and it goes through all strata of society. Spies were considered ungentlemanly in those days, and they were often hanged when they were caught. But it's funny to see how the double standard was, that gentlemen used these secrets, but they didn't consider themselves spies. So.
What about hiding your message itself?
Now that is an art in itself. I'm just developing right now a workshop to explore some of these techniques. And that's the fun part, is how do they get the message hidden. Invisible ink is the obvious one. And most invisible inks for years are what they call thermally reactive inks. Thermally reactive means just that. Heat exposes it. And if you remember from your kid days, onion juice, milk, lemon juice, things like that, they're based off that. You expose them to fire and it blackens up. One of the cheapest and easiest ones to do, and it actually is mentioned in an 1804 recipe book, is if you take lemon juice and add alum to it.
Okay.
What happens is there's something about the chemical reaction. You can't see it when you write it. And lemon juice can be iffy. If you just use lemon juice, I often get these frustratingly vague marks on the paper. They're kind of brown. You put that alum in it, it turns black when it hits the flame, and it's just like you can see why that was so so effective.
Until you put it on the flame, though, you can't see it.
Basically, yeah. And so they call it secret writing today, invisible ink. These techniques were known from antiquity. I mean, there's a message going back to the Roman times with them talking about if you write it in milk, it'll be invisible, and you heat it, you can see it again. So by the time the 18th century turn comes along, that's old hat. They don't really have, every suspicious letter is going to be run over a candle flame and see what happens. Washington and his spy ring actually used one of the more interesting and advanced techniques of the whole 18th century, and that's something called sympathetic ink. Sympathetic ink is always two-component. You've got an agent, as they call it, which is the writing fluid. Then you got a reagent, and that's the developer. So in his case, he raves about this stuff. We still don't know exactly what it was composed of. They've got some theories and some studies done on it.
But you've got different theories.
I've got some suspicions that there's something else going on here that we're missing. The suspicion is that he took the prevailing theory, I should say, that he took the two components of iron gall ink. This was given to him, the recipe given to him by one of his operatives. So tannic acid, iron sulfate, the two components. And if you write with the iron sulfate, and I've done this, it's fairly invisible. If you leave it too long, the air will oxidize it and it will appear. But in a short-term message, yes, it'll be invisible when you write it fairly so. You want the more yellow the paper, the better, because it is tend to be a little yellowish. But you let that go, and the trick is to make sure your message doesn't attract attention. Write an actual letter over the top of that with another kind of ink, and then that way they see that, the inspector looks at it, looks innocent, they pass it on. When the person receives it, they take that oak gall solution, the iron galls, tannic acid, and they soak a cloth in it and dab it over the top of the secret ink, and it instantly reacts with the air and turns black.
Right.
And so by doing that, you've got this sophisticated two-component ink that isn't going to be likely to come under scrutiny and everything. My problem with it is, and again, they've done a lot of research on this, and I'm not going to say that's wrong. I just have my major problem with the current thinking on that is Washington in his correspondence calls it the sympathetic stain. And he's just raving about this and talks about how superior this is to the old lemon juice method and everything. And at one point he says, it cannot be developed by heat or any other sort of treatment. Well, this stuff can. I've tried it with both the oak galls and the tannic acid. You hold that over a candle flame.
That does show up.
It does, very much so.
So that wouldn't work, at least by his description.
Exactly. So it doesn't meet that requirement. The other requirement is we don't know what were the ingredients. That's part of our problem. But they went out of their way to hide the process. The man who developed this sympathetic stain, I think he said several years, maybe 5 years, that he used to develop the process. And we know it used a lot of exotic ingredients because they're always talking about getting my dose of medicine in code, saying, the ink has come in. And everything. So it must not have been something like oak galls and...
Right, because they had that all the time.
Yeah, they could get that down to the hardware store. But this was apparently something more sophisticated. So at this point, there's not much known about the sympathetic stain. There's more reading.
So there's still a mystery there. We still don't actually know what that is.
In my opinion, there is, because there's just too many clues where I'm reading what Washington said, and it just doesn't seem to add up to this fluid. And the mystery is we do have existing surviving spy letters from the culprit ring that have been chemically analyzed, and they found tannic acid and iron sulfate. So something's missing. I don't know what it is, but I'd like to know more about it. I'm no expert on chemistry. If you're experts on this and you can guide me, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to know.
But I mean, those two criteria there, the heat and especially that odd chemical, like, well, everybody knew about this, right? Exactly. And people already knew about this oxgall technique, doing it in two different components.
Exactly. And the oxgall tannic acid method has been known at least since the mid-17th century. Right. So it seems unlikely that this by itself would be so mysterious by the late 18th century that it would fool the experts. So still, I think I'd love to know more about that. I'd love to see
we need to do some serious experimentation to figure that one out.
I don't know if I'm Licensed to do that, but I don't know if I want to touch those chemicals. But honestly, that's one of the fun things about doing this sort of research is you can have those questions, and you might be wrong, you might be right, but that's the whole process here is questioning the sources, finding the confirmation, and moving on from there. So, and this is what's wonderful about this sort of research is so many of them are reticent about talking about it. For example, like I said, some of those we mentioned love affairs would use this thing. They often use what they call today dead drops, and that's a Cold War term where you drop a message off at a neutral point, the other person picks it up, they never see you in public together. An 18th century dead drop was found in 2011 by a furniture restorer in England. It was a chair, an 18th century chair from a French estate, and it had come through this family. It had been in that house since before the Revolution in France. And this family in England had bought it, and they took it to the upholsterer. While he was working on it, lo and behold, in the arm of the chair, he pulls out a love letter.
Whoa.
It's written all in French, and I can't tell you the whole thing. You can look it up online and find this news story. But it basically says, my aunt's in the next room, and she's bothering me when I want to think, and do you think I would tell anybody about what's going on? I don't, I wouldn't run that risk. And it's a wonderful, charming little letter, but obviously shoved into the arm of this chair 200 years ago, and it was never received.
Exactly. Whoever was supposed to pick that up didn't find it.
So when you realize there's cases like that where they're still finding these letters today. There was a Civil War spy letter that was only decoded, I want to say 5 years ago. It had been in a museum for years, and nobody thought to actually decode it. So this is an area where they obviously did not want their secrets found out, and that's part of the challenge and the fun of it is trying to pick apart and find where the keys go and how did they do it, and try to rediscover those mysteries they wanted to forgotten.
So we talked about Turn a little bit and some of the things that they were doing. Are there more interesting things that you find?
Turn is actually a very fascinating series, and I give them full credit for making an entertaining story out of this fascinating subject. Obviously, it's like any theatrical entertainment kind of thing. They're going to cut corners, and they're going to sometimes do things for dramatic license that wouldn't have happened in real life. Exactly. So one of the classics
they're there to tell a story.
Yeah. If you want to see that, I was talking in another talk about the polygraph, not the lie detector, but the machine that copies letter. Well, if you want to see one, look at the credits of Turn. There's one prominently displayed, even though it wasn't invented until 1803. So,
whoops.
But it looks neat, and I understand why they did that. As a graphic designer myself, I would have said, "Oh, keep it in. It looks great." That's the thing is you have to sometimes make those decisions. One of the big ones was criticisms I heard leveled at it was they went about the thing with the eggs. They use eggs to do secret writing, to hide a message and send it from the line. That was never used by the Culper spy ring at all. In fact, it was such an old trick, it was probably forgotten by the 18th century. Now, in the 17th century, you see several authors mentioning it, but there's not one documented use during that war. Something they do get amazingly accurately right and in very dramatic form. One of the agents, and of course she becomes the love interest in the thing. In real life, there probably never was a love affair between Anna Strong and her neighbor Abraham Woodhull. But again, that's Hollywood. We've
got to have it.
Exactly, and it was one of the best parts of the show, I thought. However, they at least show Anna Strong as being what she was, a very independent and very forward-minded woman who took a really dangerous role in this affair because she was the linchpin. We talked about dead drops. They had a very sophisticated one for the 18th century, and it's shown beautifully in that show exactly how it worked. The way it works is the agent would come along to one of Woodhull's fields, and the dead drop was a porcelain jar. He would leave the letter or whatever he'd found in there, stopper it, put it in the field, and bury it after dark. Woodhull would come out either the next day, the next night when no one was watching, dig it up, bring it in, but now he's got to get back to Washington's hands, and that means putting it into the courier's hands. And the couriers were Brewster and those sailors that would come in the middle of the night and meet him at these coves. Well, there were 6 coves near Setauket on Long Island, and they were each numbered by the ring 1 through 6. It was Anna Strong's job to act as the courier, as the flag, to get the code across to make sure these guys knew a message was coming, and she did it in a beautiful fashion. The best way to keep a secret, as it's been said, Margaret Atwood said it, the best way to keep a secret is to pretend there isn't one. And that's exactly what she did. She had one black petticoat, and every time there was a message left and Woodhull gave her the nod, she'd put out that black petticoat on the line. And then she'd put 1, 3, 5, 6 garments out next to it. There's your code. The black petticoat meant the message is coming. And 1, 2, 3, that means the third cove. And so the boat would come into the third cove that night, they'd meet him, hand off, and out before the British were even aware it was happening. So they had a very sophisticated arrangement, and Anna Strong was definitely the linchpin that held that ring together in that sense. So there were things they did get very right in that show, and other things for dramatic license, but in a way, that doesn't matter to me because I had a friend one time who mentioned Hollywood and history. And this is a controversial thing among reenactors, I'm sure.
Sure.
I know too many people who've told me how many things are wrong with Gettysburg. I've heard that all over and over again. But think about it this way: if it wasn't for Hollywood, how would we have our history? I mean, we still think that Andrew Jackson looked like Charlton Heston because we've all seen him so many times. That's to me what the term benefit is. You watch it, you're fascinated, you think this is an amazing story. Did this really happen? Mm-hmm. And even when you read the book and find out, well, some of it happened, but some of it didn't, when you get the true story, you wouldn't probably have picked up that book except you saw it on the screen. It was so fascinating and flashy and over the top. So to me, the best way to use Hollywood, the best way to use TV is as a gateway. You get the spectacle there. Mm-hmm. And there's still cheesy movies from when I was a kid that I still am in love with because they served as the gateway for me.
They're part of our memory for remembering those things. And in the same way, folk tales, we know that there's truth there, and we also know it's over the top.
Exactly.
Right? And so we know as we interpret movies, well, this is over the top, but there's this that's real underneath. And we have the ability, this amazing ability to kind of interpret that, right?
Exactly.
It's like that part I can believe. Okay, the balloon came down and they didn't invent those for 100 years,
Yeah, and things like that. So you do get these you've got to filter it like anything else. Mm-hmm. One of the best moments I ever had in my career was years ago when I was working at Carnton Plantation in Franklin, and it's a Civil War hospital, and we give tours of the battlefield. And I had this school group, and there's this little. Looks like she's about 9 years old, and she's a troublemaker, you can tell, up front of the group. And I mentioned something about one of the portraits in the house, the lady in the portrait, and somebody said how pale she looked. And I said, well, Victorian women generally didn't wear a lot of makeup in those days. It was considered impolite. And this little girl looks me dead in the eye and she says, I don't believe you. Just like that, obviously trying to start some trouble. I stopped and I said, you don't. I said, good. And I stopped the whole school group. I said, she just said she doesn't believe me. Good. Never believe anything that somebody tells you. Look it up yourself. I said, you all have minds. You all have a reason. Look it up. Read it. Find out. Don't take my word for it. I might be wrong. I said, now when you read it, the reason I'm telling you this, you're going to find out I'm right on that. But I said, don't ever take somebody's word for it. Always do your own research. That little girl didn't know where to put her face because, I didn't fall for it. But it's valuable advice. I didn't realize how valuable it was till after that. Sure. I should apply that to my own studies because it's the same thing. TV is great. Movies are great. The internet is great.
It can lead us to questions.
It does. It always does. And by doing so, it leads you a little closer to the truth. So, yes, movies don't get every button right and they don't get that. They can't. They have a budget. They just can't do that. But they can give you the feel, and they can bring that world to life in a way that something can't.
Or they can do it wrong and you say, oh, I'm going to figure out what's
right. Exactly. So even by a negative example, they can lead you to the truth that way.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
I love all that wonderful spy information. Everybody loves spy stories, and there's so much there to cover. If you want more information about Brian Allison and what he does, there'll be a link down in the description section. Thank you all for all your amazing support, and thanks for watching.